At 6:12, the nursery corridor camera resumed after a 9-second gap. On the marble below the balustrade, a thin smear of blood trailed toward the service lift. I stopped, listening to the hum of ventilation. Prince Louis's door was ajar, his nightlight still on. Protocol said log and wait. Instinct said the timing was wrong. I stood there, hand on the radio, as footsteps approached from the west wing.
The guard reached the nursery corridor before the cleaning staff, sealing it with a quiet hand signal that needed no explanation, the kind learned through years of shared drills and unspoken rules. And the palace at that hour was still holding its breath, the lights dimmed to a functional glow, the air cool against the skin, carrying the faint chemical note of overnight polish. And there, on the marble floor beneath the balustrade, the smear resolved itself into something unmistakable, thin but deliberate, as if wiped by fabric rather than dripping freely. And he photographed it, measured its length with the edge of his boot, noted directionality, all while keeping his body angled so the open nursery door remained in his peripheral vision, because doors in that wing were never left ajar, not by staff trained to the millimeter, not by a child whose routines were scripted down to the minute. And when he leaned in, he did not touch the handle, only listened, counting breaths, until the soft, uneven sound confirmed life, the nightlight throwing a dull amber across the carpet where a corner was disturbed, toy blocks displaced from their square, and Prince Louis lay on the bed, curled inward, one sock missing, a band of red already darkening through the hem of his pajama sleeve. And the guard did not rush him, did not speak, but checked the child's pupils with the beam of a penlight dialed low, saw the flinch, the reflex intact, then backed away to call medical support through a secure channel that did not touch the general switchboard, because whatever this was, it was already off script. And while the medics moved in silence, he walked to the nearest terminal, pulled access logs for the corridor, and felt the first tightening in his chest when he saw the 9-second gap, flagged but unannotated. No maintenance tag, no override note, just a blank where procedure demanded a reason, and he cross-checked manually, counting timestamps, confirming the interruption aligned with the estimated time of injury. And when he asked for the overnight watch report, the junior officer hesitated a fraction too long before saying it had not yet been filed, the guard nodding once, filing that away, because hesitation in that building was rarer than error. And as the medics wrapped the child's arm, careful, professional, the guard noticed something else, smaller, almost trivial, a smear of blood on the inside edge of the service lift call button, wiped but not clean, suggesting someone had paused there, deciding. And it was at that moment, as he straightened and turned back toward the corridor, that footsteps approached from the west wing, measured, unhurried, carrying the weight of rank before the face came into view. He did not step aside when the figure appeared, a senior household administrator, whose presence at that hour required no explanation, yet raised its own questions, the guard offering a clipped status update devoid of speculation, injured but stable, area secured, logs under review. And the administrator listened with a stillness that felt practiced, eyes flicking once to the blood before returning to the guard's face, and asked whether the parents had been notified, a reasonable question, except protocol dictated medical assessment first. And the guard answered accordingly, watching the man's jaw tighten as he suggested the matter be contained, phrasing it as concern for the child's rest and the household's order. And when the guard mentioned the camera gap, the response came too quickly, a dismissal framed as a known technical issue, already addressed, despite the fact no such notice had been circulated. And the guard requested written confirmation, tone level, posture neutral, feeling the temperature in the corridor drop as other staff hovered just beyond earshot, pretending to check fixtures. And when the administrator said the report could wait until morning, the guard felt the familiar pressure of hierarchy pressing down, not as threat, but as expectation, the unspoken understanding that not everything needed to be recorded in real time, especially not incidents involving the inner family spaces. And he nodded once, outwardly compliant, while internally marking the discrepancy, because the service lift button, the missing sock, the unfiled watch report, these were not random. And as the administrator moved on, issuing quiet instructions to release the corridor within the hour, the guard walked back to the terminal and duplicated the log files to a secure drive authorized only for safeguarding reviews, a procedural gray area justified by the presence of a minor. And he did it without drama, without pause, because this was how lines were crossed in that building, not with shouting, but with silence. And when the medics finished and carried the child out under a blanket, shielding him from the light, the guard walked alongside until the doorway, stopping where he was required to stop, watching the small form disappear down the corridor. And only then did he allow himself to look again at the smear on the floor, already fading as staff moved to clean it, knowing that once it was gone, it would exist only in records, in timestamps, in memory. And that memory, like footage, could be interrupted, overwritten if left unguarded. And as he filed the preliminary incident note, careful with language, factual, restrained, he felt the first true resistance settle in, not from any single order, but from the cumulative weight of an institution trained to protect itself. And he understood with a clarity that did not need articulation that whatever happened in those 9 seconds was not meant to be followed, and deciding whether to follow it anyway would not be a single act, but a series of small, deliberate refusals, beginning now. By mid-morning, the palace had returned to its regulated rhythm, footsteps synchronized with bells and schedules, sunlight diffused through tall windows in a way that made every surface look orderly again, and the guard stood in the operations office reviewing overnight directives that had quietly shifted since dawn, his earlier incident note already marked for internal handling, a designation that reduced distribution without altering content, a procedural move subtle enough to appear benign. And when he was summoned to the briefing room, he noticed who was absent before who was present, the safeguarding liaison not yet arrived, medical updates rerouted through private channels, and the chair at the head occupied by a senior court official whose remit technically stopped short of security oversight, the conversation beginning with calm acknowledgments of his diligence before narrowing to language about proportionality, discretion, and the importance of avoiding misinterpretation in sensitive domestic spaces. And the guard listened without interruption, hands resting flat on the table, because interruptions suggested defensiveness, and defensiveness invited scrutiny. And when he was told that no further action was required until the family was fully briefed, he asked a single clarifying question about the camera interruption report, phrased neutrally, and the answer came with a pause that was quickly smoothed over, an assurance that technical services had resolved it, no need to duplicate effort. And the guard noted the lack of reference number, the absence of written confirmation, small omissions that mattered only if one was looking for them. And after the meeting, he returned to the corridor logs to find his access privileges temporarily limited pending review, a reversible step, common during sensitive incidents, but its timing was precise enough to feel intentional. And he adjusted, requesting information through alternate channels, documenting every request, every delay, while the palace around him hummed with controlled normalcy. And when he passed the nursery wing later that day, it had been reset entirely, no trace of the morning's disruption, toys aligned, door closed, a faint scent of disinfectant lingering just long enough to be noticed, and he stood there longer than necessary, absorbing the silence, aware that silence was being used as a corrective. And it was only when a colleague quietly mentioned that the watch officer's report had been backdated and filed under a generic maintenance note that the guard felt the pressure sharpen, not as overt resistance, but as a coordinated smoothing of edges.
and he understood then that protocol was being used not to clarify events, but to contain them, and that his role, as defined by the institution, was to accept that containment as resolution. The instruction to stand down arrived without ceremony, delivered as a routine adjustment to duty allocation, his focus reassigned to perimeter oversight, while others absorbed internal review, a move framed as trust rather than removal, and he accepted it outwardly because refusal would have required justification that could be framed as insubordination, and instead he shifted his attention to what remained within his reach, cross-referencing duty rosters, noting which names appeared repeatedly in amended logs, observing patterns that did not announce themselves but accumulated meaning through repetition. And when he requested to speak with the junior officer from the night shift, he was told the officer had been granted leave, an unusual kindness following a routine watch, and the guard acknowledged the message, then documented it, because leave granted under pressure often served as silence by other means. And as the day wore on, subtle reminders arrived from different directions, a colleague advising him to be careful, a supervisor suggesting rest, language that carried concern on the surface but functioned as guidance to disengage, and he moved through these interactions with measured responses, never contradicting, never agreeing, maintaining the narrow space where compliance and conscience overlapped. And late that afternoon, he received a redacted medical update confirming Prince Louis's injury as non-life-threatening, explanation deferred, and the guard read it twice, noting what it did not say, the absence of mechanism, the lack of context, and he placed it alongside his own notes, creating a parallel record that existed nowhere official. And when he was called again to the briefing room, this time alone, the tone was firmer, the emphasis on unity, on avoiding speculation that could harm the household, and when he was reminded of the reputational consequences of missteps, he replied with procedural language about safeguarding obligations, careful to cite policy rather than principle, and the response he received was a nod, followed by a suggestion that such obligations were best fulfilled through established channels currently being handled by others, and the meeting ended with polite finality. And as he left, he noticed the door close more deliberately than usual behind him, a small sound that lingered. And back at his post, he watched the palace settle into evening, lights warming, routines resuming, the illusion of order intact, and he felt the weight of the choice narrowing, not yet dramatic, not yet irreversible, but present in every decision to write something down or let it pass. And when he updated his personal log that night, he kept the language sparse, factual, knowing that pressure rarely announced itself loudly, that it worked through omission and delay, and that standing down, in this context, was not an end, but a test of how quietly one could be persuaded to forget.
The guard encountered the child by coincidence rather than design, a brief overlap in a secondary sitting room used for supervised transitions, the kind of space that existed precisely to avoid attention, and he noted first the stillness, the way the girl sat with her hands folded too tightly in her lap, feet not reaching the floor, posture coached into politeness beyond her years, and an aide hovered nearby with the careful alertness of someone instructed to observe without engaging. And the guard did not approach immediately, remaining at the threshold under the pretense of checking a fixture, because proximity changed behavior, and what he needed was context unaltered. And as he watched, he noticed the child's gaze track the door repeatedly, not anxious but calculating, waiting for a specific person who did not arrive. And when she finally spoke, it was to ask for water she did not drink, a delay tactic. And the aide responded with rehearsed calm, offering reassurance that carried no detail. And the guard registered the imbalance, the way the room's temperature felt slightly cooler than adjacent corridors, the lights set brighter than necessary, a controlled environment meant to discourage lingering.
And later, when he reviewed staff movement logs, he saw that the child had been relocated twice that morning without explanation, a pattern inconsistent with routine care. And when he requested clarification through safeguarding channels, he received a summary that emphasized emotional sensitivity while providing no substance. And it was only after a chance exchange with a junior nurse, voice lowered, eyes scanning, that he learned the child had refused to speak in the presence of certain staff, her responses flattening, her body closing in on itself. And the guard did not record the nurse's words verbatim, only the observable outcomes, changes in behavior, compliance under supervision, withdrawal otherwise, because interpretation could be challenged, but patterns were harder to dismiss. And when he finally crossed paths with the child again, this time in a corridor cleared for movement, she looked at him directly, held his gaze longer than politeness required, and then looked away. And in that brief contact, he saw recognition, not familiarity, but assessment, the instinctive reading of adults that children learn when authority is unpredictable. And he felt the focus of the story shift, away from logs and gaps and toward the human cost of silence. And as he walked on, he understood that whatever conflict existed among adults was already being absorbed by the smallest person in the room, and that the longer it remained unresolved, the deeper it would set. And later that evening, reviewing testimony summaries that contradicted each other in minor but telling ways, the guard recognized the emerging fault line, not between truth and falsehood, but between those prioritizing containment and those quietly repositioning themselves against it. And the child, moved without explanation, watched without being seen, sat at the center of that tension, shaping decisions without ever being asked to speak. The request to interview the child formally was denied within minutes, justification citing her well-being and the need to minimize exposure, language that aligned perfectly with safeguarding policy while effectively preventing independent assessment. And the guard noted the efficiency of the refusal, the way it arrived pre-approved. And instead, he sought secondary accounts, teachers, aides, anyone whose role placed them near without authority over. And what emerged were fragments, none decisive alone, but collectively coherent, references to sudden mood shifts, to flinching at raised voices not directed at her, to an insistence on sleeping with the light on despite previous routines. And he documented these as environmental observations, stripping them of emotional framing, because emotion invited debate. And as pressure increased to close the matter, framed as resolution rather than suppression, he found himself excluded from meetings where conclusions were drawn, summaries circulated after decisions were made. And when he raised concerns about inconsistencies, he was met with patience that felt rehearsed, assurances that all perspectives had been considered, and he began to understand that loyalty in this context was not demanded explicitly, but rewarded implicitly, through inclusion, through trust, and that questioning too long risked reclassification as a liability. And the moral conflict sharpened not through confrontation, but through accumulation, every polite deflection another weight added. And one evening, as he reviewed footage from a common area unrelated to the incident, he noticed the child again, walking beside an adult whose presence had been conspicuously absent from official summaries. The child's pace half a step behind, her hand not held but hovering near contact. And nothing illegal or overt occurred, nothing that could be flagged without context, yet the guard felt the same internal signal he had felt in the nursery corridor, the sense of something not aligning, and he froze the frame, logged the time, and moved on, because patterns were forming faster now. And when he was later reminded, gently, that his career trajectory depended on discretion, he acknowledged the statement without response, recognizing it as neither threat nor promise, but an articulation of how the system maintained itself. And that night, alone in the operations office, he weighed his options, understanding that protecting children within the institution meant working within its limits until those limits became the harm, and that stepping beyond them would not feel like heroism, but like breach. And as he prepared his notes for the next day, organizing them not as accusation but as sequence, he accepted that loyalty to rank had already been tested and found insufficient, and that the only remaining question was whether loyalty to the vulnerable could be exercised quietly, or whether it would require a line to be drawn that could not be undrawn.
The guard initiated the escalation at 0540. Not because the hour carried symbolism, but because the building was quiet enough for actions to register before explanations could catch up, and he routed the compiled record through a safeguarding channel that sat outside the household hierarchy, a channel rarely used and therefore poorly defended, attaching only primary materials, timestamps, access anomalies, movement logs, environmental observations, and the medical summary as received, stripped of commentary, because facts moved faster when they did not argue. And as the transmission completed, he closed the terminal and returned to routine patrol, posture unchanged, greeting staff with the same nods, because visibility was protection now. And within minutes the first response arrived, not a reprimand, but a request for clarification, framed politely, asking why this threshold had been met. And he replied with policy citations rather than narrative, referencing duty of care and the presence of minors. And as the morning unfolded, the palace reacted not with alarm, but with reconfiguration, meetings rescheduled, offices closed under the guise of maintenance, key figures suddenly unavailable. And the guard felt the temperature shift as his access privileges fluctuated unpredictably, restored in some areas, restricted in others, an attempt to map his influence in real time. And he continued to document, noting who avoided eye contact, who lingered, who offered unsolicited reassurance. And when a senior official requested a private conversation, the guard accepted, meeting in a neutral room with the blinds half drawn, the official's tone measured, expressing concern for process integrity, suggesting that external involvement could complicate matters unnecessarily. And the guard listened, offered acknowledgement, and repeated that the referral was procedural, not punitive. And the conversation ended without resolution, the kind of ending that signaled escalation rather than closure. And as he left the room, he passed the child's corridor, saw the light on beneath the door, and felt the narrowing again, the sense that time was now an active factor. And later, when confirmation arrived that the external unit would attend discreetly, the guard logged it and said nothing, understanding that discretion was now a shared interest for very different reasons. The arrival was quiet, 2 individuals entering through a side gate under administrative cover, their presence registered only in amended visitor logs, and the guard observed from a distance as they were briefed by staff selected for their reliability, the narrative already shaped, and he recognized the familiar pattern, containment adapting to scrutiny. And he did not intervene because intervention would have reframed the encounter as adversarial, and instead he ensured that his parallel record was synchronized, that questions could be cross-checked against original data. And when he was called in to provide clarification, he spoke minimally, answering only what was asked, letting inconsistencies surface on their own. And as the day progressed, consequences began to ripple, not dramatic removals, but subtle shifts, duties reassigned, oversight widened, the watch officer's leave extended indefinitely, and the guard sensed the institution recalibrating, absorbing impact while preserving form. And late in the afternoon he was informed that his role would be reviewed, phrased as routine, and he acknowledged it, because acceptance preserved leverage. And when he passed the sitting room again, the child was gone, relocated under formal safeguarding authority,
a small but decisive change, and he paused at the doorway longer than required, registering the absence as outcome rather than victory. And that evening, as reports circulated, with language carefully balanced between accountability and discretion, he completed his final entry for the day, noting actions taken and responsibilities transferred. And he understood that personal cost would follow in quieter ways: stalled advancement, reassignment, reputational ambiguity, and he accepted it without ceremony, because the measure of the decision was not immediate consequence, but the removal of risk from someone who could not negotiate it themselves. And as the palace settled into night again, routines intact, he resumed patrol, the building unchanged in appearance, altered only in the knowledge now embedded within it. And he carried on with the same deliberate pace, aware that crossing the line had not ended his duty, but clarified it, and that whatever followed would unfold not as resolution, but as record, preserved against erasure by the simple act of having been written down.